In the high-stakes world of drag racing, there is a saying that has been passed down through pit lanes for decades. If you aren't cheating, you aren't trying. But in the early 1990s, inside the most prestigious factory-backed class of the NHRA, that saying stopped being a joke and became a survival strategy. We aren't talking about a little gray area here. We aren't talking about bending a rule about body panels or fuel additives. We are talking about a conspiracy so deep, so technically sophisticated, and so financially motivated that it didn't just break the rules, it almost broke the sport. This is the story of the Great Gas War, the invisible nitrous oxide scandal that turned American motorsport into a crime scene. This is Legacy Motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the dark corners of automotive history. If you're someone who loves the technical grit of racing and the stories they try to bury, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to really get why this matters, you have to understand the landscape. Picture the late 1980s. This was the golden era of the factory hot rod. You had the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, locked in a marketing war that was costing them millions. The mantra was win on Sunday, sell on Monday, and nowhere was that more true than in Pro Stock. Unlike top-field dragsters or funny cars which looked like spaceships and ran on nitromethane, Pro Stock cars look like the vehicles you could actually buy. A Chevrolet Beretta, a Dodge Daytona, a Ford Probe. They had doors, they had windshields, and under the hood, they had gasoline-burning V8s. But here's the thing. Pro Stock is without a doubt the most difficult class in drag racing to find horsepower. It is a naturally aspirated class. That means no superchargers, no turbochargers, and definitely no nitrous oxide. You are limited to 500 cubic inches. You have to use 2 carburetors, the air goes in, the fuel mixes, and the spark ignites it. That's it. It is a playground for pure engineering. When you are restricted like that, finding even 5 extra horsepower is a monumental achievement. Engineers would spend months redesigning a cylinder head just to gain 2 horsepower. It was a game of inches. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. Around 1990, something shifted. A team, specifically the Wayne County Speed Shop team running Dodge Daytonas, started doing things that shouldn't have been physically possible. They weren't just winning, they were gapping the field. They were setting records that left legendary engine builders scratching their heads. Now, you might be thinking, maybe they were just smarter. Maybe they found a better airflow design. And that's a fair thought. In racing, someone is always faster. But this was different. The math didn't add up. You see, an internal combustion engine is basically an air pump. Its potential power is limited by how much air it can suck in. In a naturally aspirated 500 cubic engine, there is a theoretical ceiling. You can't just magically create more atmosphere. Yet these cars were running times that suggested they were making horsepower numbers that defied the laws of physics for that displacement. It started with whispers in the pits. Crew chiefs would stand at the starting line watching the Dodges launch and they'd hear something. Or rather, they wouldn't hear something. A naturally aspirated engine has a specific cadence. It bogs slightly under load. But these cars, they sounded different. They were too crisp. They recovered from gear shifts too quickly. Here's what most people don't realize about professional drag racers. They are like human dynos. A guy like Bob Glidden, who is basically the godfather of Pro Stock, a blue-collar Ford hero who built his own engines in a barn, could listen to a car go down the track and tell you within 10 horsepower what it was making. And Bob Glidden was looking at the Dodge boys, Darrell Alderman and Scott Jeffreyon, and he knew. He didn't just suspect, he knew in his bones that they were spraying. Spraying, of course, means using nitrous oxide. For the uninitiated, let's break down why this is such a nuclear option. Nitrous oxide, or N2O, isn't fuel, it's an oxidizer. When you heat it up, like inside a combustion chamber, it splits apart and releases massive amounts of oxygen. More oxygen means you can burn more fuel. And because it comes out of the bottle at freezing temperatures, it cools down the intake charge, making the air denser. It is effective, it is cheap, and in Pro Stock, it is strictly 100% illegal. Using nitrous in a class defined by all motor performance is like bringing a gun to a knife fight. It's not an advantage, it's a cheat code. If you have a button that gives you an extra 50 or 100 horsepower in a class where people kill for 5, you aren't racing anymore. You're robbing the bank. But making the accusation and proving it are two very different things. The NHRA, the National Hot Rod Association, had a tech department, obviously. Every car was inspected. They checked fuel, they checked weight, they checked displacement. So how do you hide a pressurized bottle, high pressure lines, solenoids, and injection nozzles in a car that is being stripped down and inspected by experts every weekend? This is where it gets really interesting. The level of engineering that went into hiding the nitrous was actually more impressive than the engineering of the engines themselves. We aren't talking about a bottle simply thrown in the back seat under a blanket. We are talking about James Bond levels of concealment. Imagine you are an NHRA inspector. You open the hood. You see a standard V8 engine. You see the braided steel fuel lines running to the carburetors. You see the brake master cylinder. You see the battery box. Everything looks stock. Everything looks legal. You have no idea that you are looking right at the cheat. The rumors began to swirl that the Dodge boys were utilizing the chassis itself to store the gas. Some said the roll cages were pressurized. Others whispered that the nitrous lines were running inside the vacuum hoses for the brakes. Bob Glidden was getting furious. He was the king of the hill, the hardest working man in the sport, and he was getting his doors blown off by guys he didn't respect, guys he believed were frauds. Glidden started going to the media. He gave interviews that were less like sports commentary and more like police statements. He was calling them out. He was telling anyone who would listen that the NHRA was letting it happen. And this is a crucial point. Why would the NHRA let it happen? Well, look at the money. Chrysler, or Dodge, was dumping millions into the sport. They were sponsoring the telecasts. They were buying ad space. The Mopar Direct Connection was the biggest marketing campaign in racing. If the NHRA busted the factory-backed team for blatant cheating, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a financial disaster. Dodge might pull out. The fans might revolt. The credibility of the entire series would be shot. So there was a perception, whether true or not, that the sanctioning body was wearing blinders. They didn't want to find anything. But Bob Glidden wasn't going to let it go. He was losing races, losing championships, and losing money. The frustration in the Ford camp was palpable. It wasn't just about losing, it was about the gaslighting. Being told you were too slow when you knew you were running at the jagged edge of perfection is a psychological torture. The tension in the pits by 1994 and 1995 was toxic. Drivers weren't talking to each other. Crew chiefs were guarding their trailers like military installations. You had the haves, the teams that everyone suspected were spraying, and the have-nots, the guys trying to do it legally. And the gap was widening. But the secrets were getting harder to keep. You can only hide a pressurized gas system for so long before physics catches up with you, or before someone gets careless, or before someone gets greedy. The first cracks in the wall of silence didn't come from an inspection. They came from a crime. It was May of 1995 when the silence finally broke, or rather, it was shattered. The Wayne County Speed Shop in Michigan was the fortress of the Dodge Boys operation. It was where the horsepower was found, where the dyno cells ran late into the night, and where the secrets were kept. But one morning, the team arrived to find a scene that looked less like a burglary and more like a mob hit. Now, usually when a race shop gets broken into, the thieves want the tools. They want the welders, the raw materials, maybe even the transmissions, because they are high-dollar items that are easy to fence. But in this break-in, the thieves left the tools, they left the cars, they left the transmissions. What they did do was systematically destroy 6 Pro Stock engines with sledgehammers.
Think about that for a second. These are engines worth $50,000 to $80,000 each, and someone didn't steal them. They murdered them. They took hammers to the blocks, the heads, the intakes. It was precise. It was thorough. And to anyone paying attention, it screamed one thing: destruction of evidence.
The official story was a break-in, but the paddock had a different theory. The rumor, and let me be clear, this has been the subject of debate for 30 years, was that the NHRA had finally cornered the Dodge team. The theory goes that the sanctioning body found the nitrous, or at least found enough proof to nail them, but they couldn't afford the scandal of banning their biggest factory team. So a deal was allegedly cut. Destroy the engines, get rid of the evidence, sit out for a while, and we won't ban you for life. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? Like something out of a bad movie. But here is the smoking gun. After that break-in, the Dodge boys, who had been absolutely dominating, suddenly couldn't qualify. They disappeared. The team that was setting records was suddenly struggling to make the field. You don't just forget how to build horsepower overnight, unless the horsepower you were building came from a bottle that you were no longer allowed to use. But even with the Dodge boys out of the picture, the genie was out of the bottle. The technology for hiding nitrous had advanced so much that other teams were now tempted to use it. If the factory teams were doing it, why shouldn't the privateers? It became an arms race of deception, and that brings us to the single most explosive moment in pro stock history. Fast forward to 1997, National Trail Raceway, Columbus, Ohio. Jerry Eckman is a solid driver, a veteran. His crew chief, Bill Orndorff, is known for being, let's say, creative. They are in the staging lanes for qualifying. The car is fired up. Everything seems normal. And then, boom. A massive explosion rocks the pit area. It wasn't a fuel line. It wasn't a catastrophic engine failure in the traditional sense. A nitrous bottle, which had been hidden inside the car's dry sump oil tank, had exploded. Here is the genius and the madness of that setup. They had hidden the nitrous bottle inside the oil reservoir. The idea was that the oil would conceal the bottle from visual inspection. But there was a fatal flaw in the physics. Racing oil gets hot, extremely hot. As the car sat idling, the hot oil heated the nitrous bottle. As nitrous gets hot, the pressure rises exponentially. Eventually, the pressure exceeded the structural integrity of the bottle and it detonated. There was no hiding it now. The shrapnel was everywhere. The evidence was literally scattered across the asphalt. It was a smoking gun the sport had been waiting for. Jerry Eckman was banned for 2 years. He was fined $50,000, a career-ending amount of money for a privateer in the 90s. He became the face of the scandal, the guy who got caught. But here's where it gets tragic. Eckman maintained for years that he was the fall guy. He claimed he didn't know the extent of it, that he was pressured by the team owner and crew chief. Whether you believe him or not, his career was effectively over. He went from a respected driver to a pariah. Meanwhile, the big factory teams, the ones who arguably started the whole era of cheating, kept their sponsorships and their reputations largely intact. The Eckman explosion forced the NHRA's hand. They couldn't ignore it anymore. The don't ask, don't tell policy on nitrous was dead. They had to start tearing engines down. They had to start using borescopes to look inside intake manifolds. They had to get serious. And just when you thought the drama had peaked, the ultimate whistleblower stepped forward. And it wasn't who anyone expected. It wasn't a disgruntled mechanic. It wasn't a rival team owner. It was Rusty Glidden. Rusty was the son of Bob Glidden, the very man who had spent years screaming about cheaters. Bob Glidden was the moral compass of pro stock. He was the guy who stood for hard work and honest racing. So when his son Rusty sat down for an interview and admitted, "Yeah, I used nitrous too," it was like the Pope admitting he robbed a bank. Rusty didn't just admit to using it, he detailed how. And this is where we get into the engineering brilliance I mentioned earlier. He explained that on his Ford Probe, they had hidden the nitrous lines inside the structural tubing of the chassis. The gas traveled through the roll cage. They had drilled tiny, microscopic holes in the intake manifold flange, holes so small you needed a magnifying glass to see them. But the real magic was the activation. It wasn't a simple button on the steering wheel, that's too obvious. The system was wired into a complex series of relays. It would only arm if the car was in high gear, the engine was above 7,000 RPM, and, get this, the brake lights were off. Why? Because inspectors would often check for switches, but they'd never think to check a logic circuit that required the car to be mid-run to activate. Rusty's confession changed the narrative completely. It proved that this wasn't just one or two rogue teams, it was endemic. It was a culture. If the Gliddens, the most honest family in racing, felt they had to cheat just to keep up, then the sport was broken. It was an admission that the playing field wasn't just tilted, it was vertical. Now, you might be thinking, why would he confess? Why destroy his own reputation? Rusty did it because he was sick of the lies. He wanted to force a reset. He essentially fell on his sword to save the sport. He showed the NHRA exactly where to look, exactly how the plumbing worked, and exactly how deep the rot went. This confession validated everything Bob Glidden had been saying, but it also complicated his legacy. Did Bob know? Could he have not known? The father-son dynamic added a Shakespearean layer to the whole mess. The aftermath of the Glidden confession was a purge. The NHRA implemented new tech procedures that were draconian. They started weighing components down to the gram. They introduced fuel checks that could detect even the slightest trace of oxidizers. The Wild West era of Pro Stock was coming to an end, but the scars remained. But here's the thing about racers. You can change the rules, but you can't change the nature of the competitor. When they took away the nitrous, the teams didn't just say, okay, we'll race fair now. No, they just moved the cheating to a different area of the car. If they couldn't make illegal horsepower, they would find illegal ways to put the legal horsepower to the ground. And that brings us to the next chapter of the saga. The tires, the transmissions, and the gray areas that defined the 2000s. Because while the nitrous bottles were gone, the desire to win at any cost was stronger than ever. You have to understand the mindset of a Pro Stock crew chief. When the NHRA cracked down on nitrous, they didn't see it as a command to stop cheating. They saw it as a challenge to get smarter. The gas was gone. The chemical advantage was dead. So the war moved from the intake manifold to the ground, specifically to the black rubber circles that connect 1,400 horsepower to the asphalt. Tires. In drag racing, tires are everything. You can have all the horsepower in the world, but if you spin the tires for a tenth of a second, you're going home. The rules state you have to use a specific compound, a specific size, and a specific brand, usually Goodyear. Everyone gets the same tire. But do they? Here's the thing. Rubber is porous. It absorbs chemicals. In the late 90s and early 2000s, a new dark art emerged: tire soaking. Teams would take these spec tires and treat them with chemical softeners, stuff that smelled like wintergreen or industrial solvent, to break down the rubber compound. The goal was to make the tire stickier, softer, more compliant. A softer tire bites the track harder on launch. It gives you a 60-foot time that is maybe 3/100th of a second faster. And then Pro Stock, 3/100ths is an eternity. The NHRA knew this was happening. They started using sniffers, devices that could detect the chemical signatures of tire treatments. They would walk down the staging lanes, sampling the air around the tires. If your tires smelled like a candy shop, you were disqualified. But the teams adapted. They developed odorless soaking agents. They would treat the tires weeks in advance so the chemicals would gas out before the race, leaving only the structural change in the rubber. It became a game of chemistry versus detection, played out in the tire trailers of America. But tires weren't the only mechanical gray area. Let's talk about transmissions. Pro Stock cars use manual transmissions, specifically clutchless 5-speeds. The gear ratios are tightly controlled to keep costs down and competition close. You can't just run a custom gear set that gives you a massive advantage. So how do you change your effective gear ratio without changing the gears? You change the tire size. Now, wait a minute.
The rules say the tire has to be a certain circumference, let's say 105 inches. If you show up with a 102-inch tire, you're illegal. But what if you can make a 105-inch tire act like a 102-inch tire during the run? This is where beadlock wheels and tire pressure manipulation came in. By running incredibly low pressures and using beadlock rims to clamp the tire to the wheel, teams could control how much the tire grew at speed. Centrifugal force makes a tire expand as it spins. A tire that grows more effectively changes your final drive ratio as you go down the track. If you could control that growth better than the guy in the other lane, you had a variable transmission that the rulebook didn't account for. It was brilliant. It was subtle, and it was nearly impossible to police because tires are organic, dynamic things. They change shape with heat and speed. How do you legislate physics? This era of mechanical manipulation culminated in one of the most controversial changes in the history of the sport, the 2016 EFI mandate. For decades, Pro Stock was defined by carburetors, big, beautiful, complicated Holley dominators sitting on top of sheet metal intake manifolds. Carburetors are analog, they are mechanical. You tune them with a screwdriver and a jet kit. They are also, historically, easier to hide things in. You can modify the Venturi, you can mess with the boosters, you can hide nitrous plates under them, as we saw. But in 2016, the NHRA dropped a nuclear bomb on the class. They mandated electronic fuel injection, EFI. This wasn't just a tech update, this was a culture shift. Suddenly, the black magic of carburetor tuning was replaced by laptops and fuel maps. The cars now had throttle bodies at the front of the engine, fed by air scoops in the bumper, not the hood. The iconic hood scoops, the visual signature of Pro Stock for 40 years, were gone. The cars looked different, they sounded different. But the real reason for the switch wasn't just modernization, it was policing. With EFI, the NHRA could mandate a spec ECU, engine control unit. They could set a rev limiter. For the first time, the sanctioning body could literally plug into the car and see exactly what the engine was doing on every single run. They could see fuel flow, ignition timing, RPM, everything. It was the end of the hidden nitrous era for good. You can't hide a nitrous spike in a data log that the officials can download. Or so they thought. The 2016 rules also introduced the hard rev limit, 10,500 RPM. This sounds high to you and me, but for a Pro Stock engine that used to scream to 11,000 or 11,500 RPM, this was a restrictor plate. And it hit one manufacturer harder than the rest, Dodge. The Chrysler Hemi engine design loves RPM. It breathes better at high speed. The GM LS-based engines were torquier. They didn't need to spin as high to make power. When the 10,500 limit was imposed, the Dodge teams felt targeted. Alan Johnson, a Mopar loyalist and champion, fought and tooth and nail to make it work. But the writing was on the wall. The rule change, intended to level the playing field and stop cheating, had inadvertently tilted the balance of power towards Chevrolet. This brings us to a fascinating concept in motorsport ethics. Is it cheating if the rules simply favor your competitor's architecture? The Dodge team certainly felt robbed. They argued that the 10,500 limit was an artificial constraint designed to help the GM teams who were struggling to keep up with the Hemi's high RPM dominance. Whether that conspiracy theory holds water is up for debate, but the result was undeniable. Dodge eventually pulled factory support from Pro Stock. The field became almost entirely Chevrolet Camaros. The spec class mentality had taken over. To stop the cheating, the NHRA had tightened the box so much that diversity died. And this is the double-edged sword of policing a sport. If you make the rules too loose, people cheat with nitrous and hidden lines. If you make them too tight, everyone ends up driving the same car, and the manufacturers leave because they can't prove their engineering superiority. But humans are creative. Even in the EFI era, even with the data logs, even with the rev limiters, the desire to find an unfair advantage didn't disappear. It just got weird. We started seeing controversies about seemingly mundane things: hood shapes, wheelie bar lengths, the angle of the rear spoiler. In 2024, we saw a massive controversy involving Erica Enders, the 6-time world champion and the face of modern pro stock. Now, Erica Enders is a polarizing figure. She is undeniably talented, one of the best drivers to ever let out a clutch. But she drives for Elite Motorsports, a team that is known for pushing the envelope. They are the New York Yankees of pro stock, well-funded, dominant, and hated by the underdogs. In 2024, Enders was disqualified for a violation involving beadlock wheels. The NHRA docked her points and fined the team. The infraction? Technically, it was about the liner inside the wheel not meeting a specific safety spec. But the paddock chatter was different. The rumor was that the team had found a way to manipulate the stiffness of the wheel itself to help the car launch harder, a modern, high-tech version of the old tire-soaking trick. Team owner Richard Freeman went ballistic. He argued that the rule didn't exist, that it was a safety interpretation, not a performance one. But the penalty stood. It was a reminder that even in the modern, sanitized, computerized era of pro stock, the cat-and-mouse game is alive and well. But there's a bigger story here, one that goes beyond just engines and tires. It's about the people, the mechanics, the crew chiefs, the drivers who dedicate their lives to this. Why do they do it? Why risk a $50,000 fine and a lifetime ban just to go 1,000th of a second faster? To understand that, you have to understand the pressure cooker of the pits. Now, look, I'm not here to judge the morality of these people. It's easy to sit on the couch and say, oh, they're cheaters, they're bad for the sport. But let's put ourselves in their shoes for a minute. Imagine you are a crew chief. Your job, your mortgage, your kid's college fund, it all depends on that car going down the track faster than the guy in the other lane. You have a team owner who just spent $2 million on a transporter, engines, and sponsorship deals. You have a manufacturer like Chevrolet or Dodge breathing down your neck, demanding results. And you look at the data and you see that the other team is running numbers that physically don't make sense. You know they're doing something. You don't know what, but you know they're bending the rules. So what do? Do you stay clean and lose every weekend? Do you let your driver look like an amateur? Do you let your sponsor walk away because you aren't winning? Or do you start looking for that gray area yourself?
This is the trap. The pressure in professional drag racing is suffocating. It turns good people into creative rule breakers. It turns engineers into magicians. And sometimes it turns them into felons, at least in the eyes of the rulebook. The modern era of cheating isn't about hiding nitrous bottles anymore. It's about interpreting the English language. It's about lawyering the rulebook. Take the factory stock showdown class. This is the modern spiritual successor to the old pro stock battles. You have the Copo Camaros, the Drag Pack Challengers, and the Cobra Jet Mustangs. These are factory-built race cars with superchargers. They are insanely fast, 7-second cars right out of the box. And because they use superchargers, the potential for manipulation is massive. In 2024, a scandal erupted that felt like a callback to the 90s. The issue was supercharger pulleys. Now, for the non-mechanics out there, a supercharger is driven by a bell connected to the engine's crankshaft. The speed at which the supercharger spins, and therefore how much boost it makes, is determined by the size of the pulleys. A smaller pulley on the supercharger spins it faster, making more boost. The NHRA mandates specific pulley sizes to keep the cars equal. They measure them with a go, no-go gauge. It's a simple metal ring. If the gauge fits over the pulley, it's legal. If it doesn't, it's too small and therefore illegal. But here's what the Chevrolet teams figured out. They realized that the shape of the pulley teeth could be modified. By machining the grooves slightly deeper or changing the angle of the teeth, they could effectively change the pitch diameter of the pulley, the effective size the belt sees, without changing the physical outer diameter that the NHRA measured. It was brilliant. The gauge fit perfectly. Visually, the pulley looked stock, but under load, the belt sat deeper in the grooves, spinning the blower faster and making maybe 2-3 pounds more boost. In a class decided by thousandths of a second, 3 pounds of boost is like finding a gold mine.
This wasn't some rogue mechanic with a file in a garage. This was high-level CNC machining. This was engineering disguised as compliance. And when the NHRA caught on, the reaction was furious. They didn't just disqualify the run, they confiscated the pulleys. They updated the rulebook mid-season. They were embarrassed because, once again, the racers were smarter than the rule makers. But notice the difference. In the 90s, they were hiding nitrous bottles and brake boosters. That was blatant, undeniable fraud. In 2024, they were machining pulley teeth to a different tolerance. It's cleaner, it's more corporate, but the intent is exactly the same, to find an unfair advantage that the other guy doesn't have. This evolution from outlaw cheating to corporate cheating reflects the changing face of motorsport. It's no longer about who has the biggest balls. It's about who has the best lawyers and the best CAD designers.
And this brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. Does the audience actually want a perfectly clean sport? Think about it. We love the stories. We love the drama. We talk about the Dodge Boys Nitrous scandal with a kind of reverence today. We call them legends. We don't spit on their graves. We build models of their cars. We watch YouTube videos about Smokey Yunick, the greatest cheater of all time, and we laugh. We celebrate the ingenuity. There is a part of us, the fans, that admires the hustle. We want to see David beat Goliath, even if David has a rock hidden in his glove. When everyone is following the rules perfectly, the racing can get, well, boring. It becomes a math equation. Car A has 1,400 horsepower. Car B has 1,400 horsepower. Driver A has a .020 reaction time. Driver B has a .020 reaction time. The result is predictable. But throw in a little creativity, a hidden nitrous line, a modified pulley, a soaked tire, and suddenly you have chaos. You have upsets. You have accusations. You have entertainment. The NHRA knows this. They walk a razor-thin line between maintaining integrity and maintaining interest. If they crack down too hard, the manufacturers leave, like Dodge did. If they don't crack down enough, the privateers leave because they can't compete. It is a balancing act that has defined the sport for 50 years. And sometimes the cheating actually drives innovation. Let's go back to the suspension wars of the early 2000s. Teams started experimenting with active suspension. Now, active suspension, where computers control the shocks in real time, is banned in almost every racing series on Earth. It's too expensive and it takes the skill away from the driver. But in Pro Stock, teams found the mechanical way to do it. They developed shock absorbers with internal valving that would dump or release pressure at a specific moment during the launch. It wasn't electronic, it was fluid dynamics. By controlling the fluid transfer inside the shock, they could make the rear of the car squat and then lock in place, planting the tires harder than a standard shock ever could. Was it illegal? Technically, no. The rulebook said no electronic control. It didn't say no complex hydraulic valving. It was a loophole, a massive, gaping loophole that allowed teams to run 60-foot times that were previously impossible. The NHRA eventually stepped in and regulated shock technology, but the damage, or the progress, depending on how you see it, was done. The knowledge gained from those illegal shocks trickled down to the aftermarket. Today, you can buy drag shocks for your street car that use similar technology. The cheating made the parts better for everyone. So, is it really cheating if it pushes the engineering forward? Or is that just a convenient excuse we use to justify breaking the rules? The reality is that Pro Stock is a dying breed of racing. The cars are expensive, millions of dollars a year to run a top team. The viewership is aging. The relevance to modern road cars is almost zero. When was the last time you saw a naturally aspirated 500 cubic inch V8 in a showroom? In this environment, the desperation to win is higher than ever because the pie is getting smaller. There are fewer sponsorships to go around, fewer factory dollars. So the fight for the crumbs is vicious. And that is why, even today, in 2026, I guarantee you there is something on a Pro Stock car that isn't quite legal. Maybe it's a new fuel additive that evaporates before the test sample can be taken. Maybe it's a new way to manipulate the clutch data. Maybe it's something we haven't even thought of yet.
Because as long as there's a rulebook, there will be someone reading it with a magnifying glass, looking for the white space between the lines.
We live in a digital age now, and the cheating has gone digital too. It's no longer about hiding a nitrous bottle in a brake booster or drilling holes in a manifold. It's about code. It's about lines of data buried deep within the firmware of an ECU that vanished the moment the cars turned off. It's about ghost maps, fuel tables that only exist under specific, undetectable conditions. The modern cheater isn't a mechanic with a wrench. He's a software engineer with a laptop. And this terrified the NHRA more than anything else. You can find the physical bottle. You can weigh a piston. You can measure a pulley. But how do you find a line of code that deletes itself? The sanctioning body has had to become a software company just to keep up. They now have dedicated IT specialists whose only job is to hack the race cars' computers to ensure they are clean. It's a cyber war fought at 200 miles per hour. But let's step back from the technology for a moment. Because at the end of the day, this isn't a story about machines. It's a story about human nature. It's about the lengths we will go to for glory. It's about the absolute, unwavering belief that we deserve to win, even if we have to break the rules to do it. There is a tragedy in that, sure. We want our heroes to be pure. We want to believe that the guy holding the trophy won because he was the best driver, not because he had the best cheat. But there is also something deeply, undeniably human about it. It's the same impulse that drives athletes to use steroids, or students to cheat on exams, or businesses to cook the books. It is the fear of being average. In the world of pro stock, average means you go home broke. It means you fire your crew. It means you sell your trailer. The stakes are life-altering. So when a crew chief is staring at a dyno sheet at 3 a.m. and he knows that a little extra help could save his team, can you really blame him? Can you honestly say you wouldn't do the same if your entire livelihood depended on it? The gas wars of the 90s, the tire soaking of the 2000s, the pulley scandals of today, they are all just chapters in the same book. The technology changes, the rules change, but the desperation remains constant. And honestly, that desperation is what makes the sport so compelling. We watch racing because it is extreme. We watch it because it pushes boundaries. If everyone followed the rules perfectly, if every car was exactly the same, if there was no controversy, no scandal, no he said, she said, would we still care? Probably not. We need the villains. We need the accusations. We need the Bob Glidden screaming at the Dodge boys. We need the Jerry Eckmans exploding in the staging lanes. It adds a layer of narrative depth that simple lap times can never provide. So, how do we judge the legacy of the pro stock cheaters? Were they criminals destroying the integrity of the sport? Or were they pioneers pushing the envelope of what was possible, forcing the sport to evolve? I think the answer is both. They broke the rules absolutely. They stole wins. They cost honest teams millions of dollars. But they also forced the NHRA to get better. They forced the technology to advance. They created a history that is richer, darker, and more fascinating than a simple list of race winners. They made pro stock legendary. And maybe, just maybe, that is their true contribution. They reminded us that in the pursuit of speed, there are no saints. There are only winners and losers. And history, as they say, is written by the winners, even if they used a little nitrous to get there. The next time you see a pro stock car launch, front wheels in the air, screaming toward the finish line, don't just look at the time on the board. Look deeper. Look at the crew chief nervously pacing the starting line. Look at the official scrambling to check the data. Look at the driver's eyes in the post-race interview. And ask yourself, what are they hiding? Because in this sport, if you aren't hiding something, you probably aren't winning. That razor-thin line between innovation and fraud that we talked about at the beginning, it never disappeared. It just moved. It's still there, waiting for the next genius, the next desperate soul to cross it. And when they do, we'll be right here, ready to tell the story. Because that is what we do at Legacy Motoring. We don't just watch the race, we watch the war. We dig into the dirty, messy, beautiful reality of motorsport. We celebrate the rogues and the rule breakers just as much as the champions. Why? because without them, it's just traffic. This has been a deep dive into the most controversial era of drag racing history. I hope it gave you a new perspective on what it really takes to win at the highest level. It's not always pretty, and it's definitely not always legal, but it is always exciting. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the pro stock underworld, if you learned something about the dark arts of racing that you didn't know before, do me a huge favor. Smash that subscribe button. It helps us keep the lights on and keep digging for these stories. Leave a comment below. Do you think that Dodge Boys were villains or just smarter than everyone else? I read every single comment and I want to know where you stand. And hey, if you want to see more content like this, maybe a deep dive into the Smokey Yunick stories or the active suspension wars of F1, let me know. There are a million skeletons in the closet of motorsport history, and I intend to find every single one of them. Thanks for watching. Keep your engines clean, or at least keep them looking clean when the inspector walks by. I'll see you in the next one.